When Connor MacLeod says there can be only one in the original Highlander, he had no idea he'd be repeating that line for years. Just when he thinks he has finally made it to be the only one, another immortal seems to pop up, challenging him for that title. How many ones can there be? As it turns out, quite a few. After the problems with making Highlander II and the anemic box office for it, it was decided to completely ignore everything surrounding that film and create a direct sequel to the original. They dropped any mention of the planet Zeist, ignored the fact that immortals are supposed to be aliens, and reverted the setting back to 7 years after the original. Even under the best circumstances, films are hard to produce. How does one fare after completely rebooting the franchise? Surprisingly well. The creation of Highlander: The Final Dimension is far from perfect, but after the debacle of creating the second film, surely nothing crazy could happen the third time out, right? Well, let's find out here on What the F Happened to This Movie. One idea that was thrown around was to actually make this film a prequel. An interesting idea for a film franchise that's known for jumping around in time. It would show Connor arriving in New York to prepare for the upcoming gathering. This was eventually pushed aside for a straight-up sequel, although what that story would be wasn't decided upon until a few rewrites later. The original script was different from what we would end up with theatrically, with flashbacks that were originally going to take place in 17th century Scotland and 18th century England. MacLeod had gained another mentor after the death of Ramirez. Kavanaugh would help train MacLeod to become an even better swordsman and teach him about the gathering. The main villain was named Kilvera, and Connor would face him in multiple time periods. Throughout the film, we see what happened to Connor between burying his original wife Heather and his arrival in New York in the first film. One of the fun scenes set in England would have shown a face-off between MacLeod and Jack the Ripper. It turns out that the most infamous serial killer in history was in fact an immortal. We also would have seen the return of the characters of Rachel Ellenstein and Detective Bedso from the original film. This would have helped create a direct connection to the original, which the second film did not have. The idea may have been to help erase the second film completely from the audience's mind. We'll never know though, because this script was ultimately scrapped in favor of the film we would see in theaters. In Highlander: The Final Dimension, we catch up with Connor just as he has buried his first wife. He travels to Japan to train with an immortal named Nakano. A friend of Ramirez, he promises to teach MacLeod the magic of illusion and train him to use the katana sword. During their training, Nakano warns Connor of an immortal called Kane. He is traveling across Asia with 2 other immortal henchmen. Before long, Kane finds his way to the cave Nakano and MacLeod are training in. He beheads Nakano and steals his powers of illusion. As Connor escapes, Nakano's energy from the quickening collapses the cave and traps Kane inside. We then move to the present day, where an archaeologist is excavating the cave and accidentally frees Kane. He decides to find Connor and get revenge for the centuries he has spent trapped underground. Connor senses Kane's presence and returns to the Big Apple. He fights one of Kane's newly released henchmen, and it is reinvigorated with the quickening. When Kane threatens Connor's adopted son, the two face off for a final showdown to finally, once again, for real this time, determine who will win the gathering. The producers decided to go back to the idea that had worked well for them in the first film and hire a music video director. This time around, they brought in Andy Morahan, who had made a name for himself directing Guns N' Roses videos, including the Terminator 2 tie-in, You Could Be Mine. When it came time to cast the film, Christopher Lambert had a suggestion. The year before, he had been in the movie Gunman with Mario Van Peebles. He had such a great time working with the actor that he wanted him to play Kane. Peebles loved the idea and accepted it right away. However, one person who was not excited to see Peebles join the production was not someone you might think. Since the director had such a close relationship with Guns N' Roses, he approached them about doing the soundtrack, just as Queen had done for the first film. According to Morahan, they were excited to do it, but it all fell apart when Axl Rose learned Mario Van Peebles was part of the cast. He agreed to do it only if Peebles was replaced. This was a bit of an odd request, and the production team decided against it. What problem Axl Rose had with Mario Van Peebles has never been revealed. If that had been the biggest problem Van Peebles had had on the film, it might have been an okay shoot. While the crew was filming in Montreal, standing in for New York, two local men were hired for a scene where the newly awakened Kane gets robbed in an alleyway. The two men were in the local punk scene and had mohawks, and it was thought that they would add some fun, visual flair to the scene. They were paid a small fee and brought to the set, and the two men were later seen taking drugs, with crew members overhearing them plotting to kidnap Van Peebles by stealing the makeup RV with him in it. The scene was cut, and the men were taken away by security. It would turn out good for the production to have Van Peebles in the film. He would cause Christopher Lambert to give his all during every single fight scene. Some of the moves done between the two actors, such as headbutts, punches, and elbowing, were improvised while filming. The director speculated that they were trying to outdo each other, which worked great for the characters. Lambert would also cause the script to be heavily rewritten during filming. He would insist that he did not have enough dialogue. The director would try to convince him that if the character talked too much in the film, it would take away from the character's mystique. Lambert would end up counting the total number of words in the entire script and say that he needed a lot more. This, of course, caused new lines to be added and new scenes to be shot. Also a cause of frustration for Lambert was his pay. At one point, he would walk off the film due to a pay dispute. He would, of course, eventually be talked back into returning. Some of the shooting on location would also tend to be problematic. While shooting the scene where Connor practices with his sword near his desert compound, sand would keep getting inside the camera, damaging the film stock. This scene would have to be reshot. One thing the producers wanted to include in the film was references to the Highlander TV series. Even though Connor had appeared in the first episode to hand off the lead role to Adrian Paul as Duncan MacLeod, the TV series seemed to have a different continuity altogether. Connor was no longer the only immortal, and Duncan encountered a new foe in every episode. With these connections, it would link both properties together. Duncan MacLeod would appear in the fourth film, Highlander Endgame, and star in a TV film of his own. The film would be released in theaters on January 25th, 1995. It would end up being rated PG-13 after a few sex scenes had been cut and the violence had been toned down. On home video, it would receive a special director's cut that was rated R. The sex scenes were added back in, and the trimmed down violence was reinstated. Most notably, Kane's head rolling off his body when he's decapitated. For some of the foreign markets, the title was changed to Highlander III, the Sorcerer. One thing that this film can claim out of the entire Highlander franchise is that it made more money at the box office than its budget. As much as Highlander had embedded itself into pop culture, the series has never done well in theaters except for this entry. When asked about his time on the film, director Andy Morahan said he considered it equal to the first film, but ultimately he felt unfulfilled with the result. He expressed that he was beaten up by the experience, as the producers and lead actor had compromised his vision through constant changes during production. Fans of the Highlander series would ultimately enjoy the return to the lore set in place by the first film. Completely ignoring the second film seemed to be a good approach here, and it was evident from the theatrical turnout. Sometimes you can go back and rewrite your own history, whether that is as an immortal that decapitates other immortals to gain all the knowledge in the universe, or just to ignore a dystopian future with no ozone layer that no one really wanted. Might as well make it a future that's a little brighter